Rain hit the mansion like a barrage, each drop a tiny drum, announcing the storm. Inside, the library held its own weather, a low, steady heat from the fireplace, the soft tick of a mantel clock, the muffled roar of the city beyond thick glass. Burgundy velvet caught the firelight in waves. A leather armchair sat framed by shelves whose spines smelled of dust and travels. On the small table beside that chair lay an envelope, bulging just enough to be obvious, marked with a neat, impersonal band of paper. $5,000 in cash, arranged to stare at anyone who might notice. Arthur Sterling kept his eyes closed. Not because he slept. He had perfected the look of sleep, the way some men perfected investments, practiced, flawless, and precisely unemotional. 50 years of building and protecting a fortune had taught him to distrust the warmth of faces, the earnestness of pleas, the gestures of people who needed something he had. Betrayal, he told himself, was the only teacher that left a mark you could read. He had once given his trust and been burned. Afterward, kindness always smelled faintly of calculation. The envelope on the table was part of an experiment, a deliberate provocation he had designed to confirm what experience had already convinced him of, that people, when given opportunity, would take the easy route. It was a test. He had shaped it like a needle to pierce a soft truth. Outside, the rain blurred the world into watercolor. Inside, Arthur breathed the slow, measured breath of a man who tells himself he is immune. At the door stood Sarah, with the storm pressed against her coat. Her hair was pinned hastily, her eyes were careful. In one hand she carried a dripping umbrella, in the other she held a small bundle under a towel. Leo, 7 years old, curled and sleep-mussed, a thin weight on her hip. Sarah had been in Arthur's employ for just a few months. She cleaned in the mornings, did the laundry, made sure the lady of the house's shoes matched, and the silver gleamed. She was a widow, practical enough to be tenacious, small enough to seem fragile in a place of high ceilings and broad marble steps. Her life had been a series of negotiations, between rent and groceries, between her son's fever and the demand for continuity. She treated the mansion like a place of work, not of awe. She treated it carefully because it paid the bills. "You stay put by the window, Leo," she told him softly. Her voice had that double duty of mother and employee, gentle for the child, firm for her own nerves. "Don't touch anything. Not the books, not the lamp, not the couch, not anything." Leo blinked wide, quick to obey. He was wet at the shoulders where the umbrella had failed, his jacket clinging a little damp to his back. He had the look of a child who had learned to be quiet around other people's riches. Small, observant, moving like someone who had seen too much discussion about money and too few moments of simple play. Tucked into his inner pocket was a battered toy car, its paint rubbed thin, one gold wheel loose but steady when you rolled it. It was all that he had left from his father, a man whose absence shaped the contours of every day. Sarah kissed his forehead the way one arranges a corner back into place. "Remember, you wait." She straightened, smoothed the damp collar of her own coat, and left him in the library. Leo watched her go, a small human island in the rich sea of the room. The door side closed. Arthur listened. He had built his test on small theatrics. The envelope, ostentatious but not so ostentatious as to be unbelievable. The seat by the fire, the subtle rumple of his jacket to suggest vulnerability. He had arranged the room to attract a curious hand. He would pretend to doze. He would be the patient predator. The security cameras were turned off to keep things natural, he told himself with a sliver of humor, because the point of a true test was to let people act spontaneously. He had watched the house staff go to and fro for years, cataloguing behaviors into mental ledgers, and now he wanted a proof that matched his ledger. So he lay still. His hands, aged and knotted like colonized roots, rested on the arms of the chair. The mantel clock marked time with a polite, old-fashioned tick. Rain drummed its rhythm against the panes. The fire made the room smell of tallow and old books. Arthur's chest rose and fell as if in sleep. He listened to the smallest sounds in the room. Leo's breath, the faint rasp of wet fabric, the barely audible scrape of a shoe on an oriental rug. Leo sat for a long time looking out at the rain. He had already memorized the mansion's rules from 100 whispered warnings. Don't touch, don't take, don't be seen. But the human mind lives in small swivels. A child's eyes roam. They find details that adults call clutter and call them stories. He saw the envelope first. Its corner peeped from the table, a pale suggestion of promise that could be mistaken for mislaid business. The paper band read like a small formal invitation. A test might be here. He looked at it, his little fingers twitching under the damp sleeve. He thought of his rent ledger, the unpaid radius of his life. The toy car in his pocket seemed to weigh less than an idea. He rose. Every small step made the old rug whisper. He moved like a cat, not out of stealth, but out of the reverence children learn for sacred things that belong to someone else. Up close, the envelope smelled of paper and a faint trace of cologne. Leo's hand hovered. It brushed the edge. If the child had been one who made the economy of his life a ledger, this would have been the moment he took. But the world is often kinder to those who hold nothing. Arthur felt it, the infinitesimal change in the room, the moment a small body decided its course. He held his breath. For a man who had wasted decades on rule books, breath held like a confirmation of theory. His mind, like a ledger retracing entries, began to chalk this in the margin. Leo's hand did something Arthur did not expect. Instead of reaching for the money, he tugged his damp jacket from his shoulders. It was thin, a collar rubbed to pale, a jacket that had lived many winters. Arthur's shoulder blades shivered in the chair as a small draught found him, an old man's shiver, barely noticed by the house's common customers. Leo came closer, placing the jacket over the old man's knees as if tucking a stranger into bed. His little hand smoothed the fabric with a careful, reverent motion, more like one might smooth a blanket over a sleeping sibling than a possession acquired by chance. Then his fingers brushed the envelope. He didn't lift it to inspect the bills. He steadied it, nudging it slightly so it would sit flat and not slip to the floor. There was a tenderness to the movement, a mechanical kindness. He looked at the face before him, a face drawn and practiced into lines of suspicion, and saw, perhaps, a human need rather than an opportunity. The room poised, waiting for the pronouncement of the experiment. A small sound from the doorway shattered the delicate hush. The poised balance tipped. Sarah returned with a tray, teacups, a folded towel, her steps brisk and practical. She had forgotten the tea in the kitchen. She had been in and out, and the storm made everything small and urgent. She didn't see the jacket initially. She registered instead a faint, damp spot on the arm of Arthur's chair, a pale, round blot where the rain had tracked on Leo's sleeve. Her breath tightened. "Oh, no," she whispered before she could stop herself, the sound almost a prayer. She thought automatically of the household rules, of Mr. Sterling's fastidiousness. In the same breath she feared for the consequences, for being the one responsible for her son's presence. Her hands hovered over the tray, uncertain. Leo heard panic in her second, and the child's instinct, so like his mother's own careful survival habit, kicked in differently. He reached for his pocket, his small fingers fumbling at the battered toy car. It came out with a squeak, its wheels jangling. The car glinted, paint worn thin but still familiar. "I'm sorry," he said, voice small and solemn. It was not the voice of calculation. It was the voice of someone who believed reparations were made with what you had. He pushed the car toward the chair as if offering a pawn, a promise, a peace offering. Sarah's face folded. She made to scoop him up, to apologize to Mr. Sterling for the damp, to apologize for her son's breach of household order. She saw the envelope, and her mouth opened with a different, sharper fear. She saw opportunity and danger braided together. In that quick moment, the script she had practiced for years, the apology, the clumsy attempt to explain, replayed in her head. And then Arthur unclenched his inner fist. He had to. The scene had hit him like cold water. He had expected greed, nimbleness, the practiced hand that took without asking. Instead, he had watched a small boy put his coat over the knees of a man he had never met and smooth a parcel so it would not fall. The toy car, offered without negotiation, was an honest currency offered in apology for something the child thought he had done wrong. Arthur opened his eyes. They were not the eyes of a man breaking a test. They were the eyes of a man who felt the first fissure. He watched Sarah's face collapse and rise. He watched Leo's small shoulders tremble with the gravity of his offering. He held back the reflex to say, "Of course you can't," which would have been the ledger again. He instead let the sound of his voice be the slow, used thing it could be when one finally speaks the truth. "You're all right," he said. Not a loud pronouncement, more an admission. "The chair isn't ruined." Sarah's lips formed words too fast for her throat to shape. "Mr. Sterling—" He held up a hand. "Sit," he said to both of them, and there was nothing of the slightly derisive tone he'd used in boardrooms. "Sit down." They did not initially because they had been trained to move quickly when told what to do, to vanish fast, as the watchers of the house required. Sarah's body remembered protocol. But Leo stayed rooted, his toy car still on the floor between his small shoes, his jacket half covering the old man's knees like a tentative bridge. Arthur watched him. He watched the way Leo's fingers found the car's scuffed roof, the way his thumb rubbed absent-mindedly at the gold wheel. He heard the muffled rain. He thought of the ledger again and found no entry that matched the quiet pressure in his chest. "I was asleep," Arthur said, and for the first time in many years confessed something he had planned to keep secret. "I was not actually asleep." Sarah's face shifted into a new register, alarm, humiliation, then a slow, wary anger. "You set a trap," she said. The words were small, but every one of them carried the weight of truth. "You left money there on purpose. You watched us to see if we'd take it." Arthur made no attempt to deny it. The room was an honest place in that moment, free of his usual manipulations. "Yes," he said, "I did, to see what would happen." Sarah's voice hardened. "That is wrong, Mr. Sterling, you can't—" Her sentence ended on a low breath. She had torn a part of herself between the fear of losing work and the disgust at being treated like a subject in some cruel experiment. Leo, who could not quite process the tangle of adult accusation, stepped forward. "I didn't take it," he said, holding his toy out, as if to counterbalance his words with the physical fact of the car. "I didn't want it. He stopped. Children often lack the rhetoric to defend a moral steadying. They have only action. He moved the car onto the arm of the chair and placed his small hand on the old man's sleeve. Arthur looked at that hand. He saw not a hand that reached for what it could get, but one offering something precious and small. He saw a child who had, by habit or instinct, given what little he had to heal a wrong he believed he'd made. The image lodged. For a long minute, no one spoke. The rain filled the interim. The mantel clock said its patient seconds. Then Arthur did something he had not done in a public life of transactions. He apologized. "I shouldn't have done that," he said. The sentence was clumsy, a man brushing off a suit jacket of old behavior. It was not a grand apology. It was a single, bruised sentence. "It was a test, a stupid one. A thing I thought would prove something. I thought—" He stopped because the belief that could have been concluded, that people would take advantage, that they'd be easy. He could have, in that moment, rationalized his behavior into 1,000 corporate metaphors. He could have pointed to betrayals, to the endless parade of people who wanted what he had and left a little less honest for it. Instead, his voice caught on a different memory, the first trust he had ever extended, and the sting of its betrayal. The guilt in the tone was not theatrical. It was an old man finally letting another see the hairline crack he'd kept hidden. Sarah folded into him a complex expression: shock, relief, suspicion, and an instinctive protective hunger for what would secure her son's future. "You can't do that," she said again. "You can't test people like that." "I know," Arthur answered. "You're right. It was wrong." He stood slowly, the old bones complaining. He walked to the table and touched the band around the envelope with a finger that trembled imperceptibly. He could have taken the money back into his pocket, could have let the experiment remain as it had been, proof of his thesis. Instead, he did something else. He pushed the envelope across the table toward Sarah. "Take this," he said, "for the work you've done, for the wet jacket, for Leo." Sarah's eyes widened with a grief that was almost visible, relief laced with humiliation, gratitude threaded with the fear of being patronized. The money lay there, not a test anymore, but an offer that carried with it the heavy hand of being singled out by a man who had seen what he did wrong and wanted to fix it in a way he could understand, through transaction. "No," Sarah murmured. She glanced at her son, at the boy who had offered a toy because it made him feel like he could make amends. She set a hand on Leo's hair, smoothing it back the only way she could still be both mother and housekeeper. "We can't accept a—" Arthur cut her off gently. "It's not charity," he said. "Take it as—" He paused, looking for honest currency beyond money. "Take it as an apology and an acknowledgement. I owe you that." There was a humanness to the offer that unsettled both of them. Money had always been the simplest language Arthur knew. He used it like a muscle. To him, offering the envelope was as natural as a handshake. To Sarah, it felt like a paradox. She had followed the rules and been treated like a subject. Now the rule-breaker wanted to mend things with what he knew best. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah said, voice steadier now, "we don't need handouts." The line between refusal and pride is narrow and worn. She walked it with care. "We have pride." Arthur considered that, watching the set of her jaw, the way dignity stiffened her spine. Then he did another thing few in his circle ever watched him do. He offered, not money alone, but an arrangement that suggested a different valuation of what it meant to help. "If you'll let me," he said, "I want to do more than hand you cash when the rain gets in. I would like—" He searched for a word that didn't sound like bribery. "To see Leo in school without you worrying about tuition. If you'd allow it, I can arrange for him tuition, books. He could stay on the property if that helps. He could work after school in the study. Not as a servant, but as a helper. For learning's sake, he could have a place here to study." Sarah blinked, as if the offer were both miraculous and intrusive. The idea of her child crossing the threshold of such a world and being shaped by it was a dangerous dream. "That's generous," she said. "Too generous. I don't want—" "You don't have to answer now," Arthur interrupted. "Nor am I offering to buy your gratitude. I'm offering an apology, with a plan attached." Leo watched all this with that particular stillness children acquire when adults speak in large, complicated sentences. He understood the word school, like a promise he had seen on the television in the library, a promise that meant a horizon wider than the neighborhood. He could not pass the moral calculus of his mother's pride or Arthur's guilt. He only knew the warmth that came up his arms when the damp jacket had covered the old man's knees, and the way the toy car had rung like a bell in the silence. Arthur turned the wheel of this new offer slowly, as if examining a photograph of himself at different ages. He had spent a life constructing legacies of stone and steel, foundations and corporate names etched in stone. Now he felt the strange new urge to build something that could alter a life from the inside out. Yet he also felt the dangerous draw of fixing his conscience with money. That was the ledger again, attempting to reconcile itself by figures. "I can't undo what I did," Arthur said softly. "I can only try to make it right." Sarah's eyes filled unexpectedly with water. She blinked hard, turned her face toward the mantel as if to hide the leak. She had not expected a man like Arthur to say such direct, vulnerable things. The economy of their relationship had just shifted on a pivot the size of a child's hand. Leo placed his toy car into Arthur's palm with all the solemnity of a vow. The old man's fingers closed around the small metal shape, and for a moment the world narrowed to the hot, surprising weight of a child's trust. Arthur studied the car, the worn paint, the nicked roof, the loose gold wheel that flashed dimly when the firelight caught it. He saw a story in that small object, a father's absence, a modest, warm life, the capacity for generosity, something money could not wholly frame. He looked up at the boy. He could have used the toy car as proof, a symbol to be catalogued in the ledger along with the envelope. He could have set it aside. Instead, he did something he had not done in years. He smiled, quietly and without spectacle. The smile was not for pride, nor for satisfaction. It was the expression of a man encountering the explanation to an equation he had for years misread. "Thank you," Arthur said to Leo, and the words had the awkward, genuine quality of someone stepping into new behavior. "I won't forget." Sarah's hand tightened unconsciously on the towel in her grip. "Mr. Sterling, if you truly mean this—" She did not finish. The rest of the sentence was heavy with whole futures. "I mean it," he said. There was a tremor of silence then, like a chord held. The rain continued its rhythm against the window, as if unaware that the small drama inside the mansion had tilted the axis of 3 lives. Leo shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His jacket was still over Arthur's knees, and now the wet had soaked through the thin fabric to touch the old man's trouser leg, leaving a faint, darker circle. The sight of the stain should have been an outrage in another life. Here it was, only a detail, small and precise. Outside, thunder rolled like distant argument. Inside, the library held the soft sound of pages settling in their spines, as if the house were eavesdropping. Arthur reached for the envelope and, instead of straightening the band and sliding it into his pocket, tore the band and folded the cash into a neat stack. He slid it back across to Sarah. She hesitated, then, with a practical hand, tucked it into her purse. Her fingers closed around it like a lifeline. "I will make arrangements for Leo's schooling," Arthur said. He did not explain how he intended to fund it, or where the child would live, or how his own pride wanted to be salved by being seen to give. He only said the words, and that was enough to swing open a door. But Arthur had been a man of elaborate plans all his life. Old habits die slow, and the impulse to structure was strong. He also felt the counterweight of his own conscience, his recognition that the test had been a moral misstep designed to confirm a dark belief. He wanted to correct, not dominate. He wanted to rebuild, not purchase absolution. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah said, "reach for steadiness now. We will not take anything that makes you feel—" Her sentence wandered. She feared the cost to his dignity. She feared the cost to her son's dignity. She feared the public price of being seen as purchased. "Then we will find a way that doesn't." Arthur was careful with his wording. "I'm not seeking gratitude. I'm offering opportunity." The room registered the new terms. Leo, feeling the weight of adult negotiation, let his fingers close around the toy car and slide it back into his pocket. The gesture was involuntary, like a child reclaiming a sacrament. There was still space in the silence for Arthur to resume the mask, to close his eyes again and pretend the test had yielded the result he had expected. He could return to his ledger and write a line that said, "Confirmed. Generosity often does not exist without strings." But the smallness of the moments he had just witnessed resisted being catalogued. The child's coat, the offered car, the envelope now folded into a purse. These were not the tidy boxes his mind preferred. He looked at Sarah, at her weary yet fierce expression. He looked at Leo, at his bright but wary face. He thought of the foundation names etched on the building he had funded and realized acutely that names carved into stone were an odd kind of immortality. They preserved the shape of generosity without guaranteeing its substance. "I will instruct my lawyers to set something up," Arthur said finally. "Not a charity in the public sense, something private, immediate. A trust for education, overseen by someone you trust. Not me, not a foundation to parade, just practical help." Sarah's mouth opened. She considered this, then closed it. The idea of help that did not humiliate was foreign. Tears leaked down, and she did not try to hide them now. It was not a theatrical show of gratitude. It was the small flood that comes when the dam of daily endurance gives way. She began, then stopped. The offer was too much to shape into ordinary words. "There are forms, "We'll handle it," Arthur said. "I will make sure the process is discreet. No papers on the kitchen table announcing charity. If Leo agrees, I'll find a tutor, arrange for him to attend the school across town. He will not have to face the indignity of scholarships or applications in public. It will be simple, paid, quiet." Leo, who had been listening with the sort of attention only children can give to promises involving school, nodded solemnly. His chin rose like a small flag. The toy car, tucked in his pocket, rattled softly as if to underscore the new terms. Sarah stood there, with the warm towel clutched to her breast, and made a choice between pride and possibility. It was not a choice free of complexity. It was a mother selecting the grain that would seed a field. She accepted, not with a show of dramatic relief, but with the resolute calm of someone who weighs the possible futures and chooses the one that best shelters her child. "Okay," she said. The word was small but decisive. Arthur exhaled. A decade of practice in contingent kindness had taught him to expect this moment to be tidy. Instead, it was messy and real. He felt gone, a strange, almost painful weight lift from him. The truth was not that his bitterness evaporated in an instant, but that it had been tilted by a child's hand. For Arthur, the test had failed to prove his thesis. It had offered a counterexample sharp enough to cleave his conviction. That was dangerous in the way truth can be. Truth obliges action. He sat back in the armchair, closed his eyes for a second, and opened them again to the firelight. He looked at the toy car in his palm, warm from contact, and smoothed his thumb over the small, worn hood. He imagined, briefly, the man he had been in the years before. Bitterness hardened around his ribs. A younger man who might have given not to soothe a conscience, but to build a bridge. He felt the stranger of that younger self, somewhere under the ash. "You will need someone to oversee the arrangements," he said, as if committing. "Bring me a list, a name you trust, and we will make it happen." Sarah's relief was contained now, practical. "Yes, I will, thank you. We'll bring a name tomorrow." They talked a little more, practicalities, not the knotted moralities. They arranged a dinner date of sorts, an awkward but real meeting born of necessity, the man who had set a test, the woman he employed, and her son whose toy car lay like an artifact between them. The fire hummed, the rain attenuated to a steady wash. Arthur listened to Leo's soft breathing as the child fell asleep on a rug near the arm of the chair, the toy car held in a small fist. He thought of the future, like a book he had not yet read, pages uncreased. He felt for the first time in a very long while the inconvenient human need to be seen as more than a ledger. But old constructs take time to change. The test had been wrong, he had admitted it. He had offered money in the way he knew how, and then extended a different form of help that exceeded cash. Yet the pattern of his life, the isolation, the suspicion, the habit of setting experiments to justify conclusions, did not dissolve with a single act of contrition. The fissure that had opened in his heart was small and perfectly placed. It would perhaps widen slowly in time, or it might remain a hairline fracture that only he would know was there. He glanced at the mantel clock and realized how many hours had passed. He had expected proof that people would take advantage. Instead, he had found the opposite, that a child could offer his last treasure rather than take what was not his. The astonishment of that, so the headline would one day say, was not in the spectacle, but in the simplicity. Arthur reached out then, and with a motion that surprised him, placed the toy car gently on the table beside the envelope he had just pushed across. It seemed wrong to put it in his pocket, but wrong was no longer the default. He wanted the car to be visible, a reminder. He wanted to keep something that belonged to Leo in a place where he could think on it when he awoke in the night with the habit of mistrust. The house settled. The rain softened. For a man who had expected to confirm his worst suspicions, the remainder of the evening was quiet, complicated, and unexpectedly gentle. The ledger of Arthur Sterling's life had, by the smallest hand, been challenged. He lay awake that night after Sarah and Leo had gone, thinking in a kind of disordered arithmetic about what he had seen. He had offered money, yes, but what he had been given was a different kind of currency, a look at someone who would not, in the face of need, choose advantage. He catalogued this new item in his mind like a jewel. It did not clear the losses he had accumulated over a life of guardedness. It did, however, insist on being seen. Outside, the storm moved on without seeking permission. The city breathed under its wet blanket. Inside the mansion, Arthur turned over the toy car in his hand and found himself smiling without irony. The morning's plan to test his employees suddenly seemed a cheap cruelty. The revelation that followed, how small acts reveal character, sat with him like a patient guest. He did not yet know what he would do. He had promised a trust, made a practical offer, and felt the immediate aftermath of contrition. The moral balance had been disturbed. He found himself leaning toward repair. But repair is not a single act. It is a commitment of habit. He could not be sure he would keep it. A clock chimed the hour. Arthur slid the toy car into the pocket of his jacket then, almost on impulse. It was not theft. It was possession for a purpose. He would place it somewhere visible, a talisman against a future falling back into old cynicism. In the study downstairs, the envelope, its band torn, waited on the table like a symbol. Outside, the housekeeper swept the marble with the indifference of someone who had seen storms and tempests of another sort. In the rooms above, the portraits stared blankly from their gilt frames, witnesses to a small drama no portrait could quite contain. Arthur poured himself brandy and sat with his back to the fire, the weight of new possibilities pressing pleasantly and fearfully at once. He had done a bad thing, and then attempted to patch it in a way he thought would recast him. Whether the patch would hold was not yet known. Between his fingers, the toy car felt like a live thing. At some point, exhaustion eased him into a careful sleep, not the strategic sleep of the morning's ploy, but a true, if light, rest. He dreamt briefly of his own father, of a hand placed years ago on his shoulder with a word of advice about giving. He woke with the echo of that touch and an unfamiliar wish not to be remembered for tests. When Sarah tucked Leo into bed for the night in the small room provided for him, the house allowed for certain gestures of accommodation. She placed the envelope's cash into the back of a dresser drawer. She did not look at it as charity, but as a cushion to be used cautiously. She thought of the tutor she could ask for, the school she could consider. Her decisions were practical and protective, threaded with a mother's prudent fear. She did not sleep immediately. She listened for footsteps on the mansion stairs, for any signal that the world had not yet completed its assessment of them. Leo, curled under a thin blanket, held his toy car close and turned it over in his hands. The gold wheel winked in the dim light like a promise offered to a child who had given all he could, and discovered the world returned more than it took. Outside, through the sleeping town, something was changing in a small, precise way. Inside the mansion, 3 lives had intersected and rearranged the furniture of intention. No one could say yet how long the crack in Arthur's heart would remain, or whether his change would be permanent. But a small coin, no, a small car, had been handed over, and with it had come a simple moral revelation. Kindness had been offered where suspicion had been expected. If you like stories that restore faith in small human acts, consider subscribing. The night wore its black robe across the town. Arthur lay awake for some minutes, then turned over, the toy car against his palm, and thought of the ways in which wealth can isolate a person from the grit and the generosity of ordinary human life. He wondered if his children would ever understand such quiet redirections. He did not yet know how his biological children, sharp and entitled in the ways that often accompany inherited wealth, would react if told he intended to change the distribution of his estate. Those were complications he did not wish to think about now. Tonight, he only wanted to consider the immediate obligation standing before him, to make right for a trap he had set, and to honor a small boy who had given away his last treasure, rather than take what was not his. The next morning would be a day for decisions. There would be lawyers to call, papers to draft, and 1,000 social mechanics to negotiate. The mansion would hum with the curious gossip of staff, and Arthur's reputation, hard as marble, would be pried at by tongues hungry for a story. But the first movement had been made, an experiment undone by the simplest, most disarming thing a human could do. He rose as the first grey light crawled through the curtains and stood by the window, looking out at puddles that reflected the sky like large, reluctant mirrors. The toy car lay on the table, a small comet of paint and brass against the dark wood. Arthur touched it once, as if confirming that it was real. He had, in the heat of the test, been wrong. He had admitted it. He had offered. He had placed the first stone of a bridge he did not yet know how to finish. The story was not over. Decisions remained. Pride would murmur counsels. Habit would offer familiar escapes. But a new element had been introduced into Arthur's life, small and persistent. The recognition that generosity and forgiveness could look like everyday acts, not grandiose gestures. It could be the quiet placement of a jacket over knees, the offering of a toy car, the gentle returning of an envelope that had been intended as bait. The clock in the study marked its time. The rooms arranged themselves for the day. Voices would begin to stir. Arthur set his jaw, not in the rigid way of old, but in the thicker, more complicated way of someone who has resolved to unlearn a practice. He took the toy car and placed it in his pocket. He wanted to carry the reminder close. He had not yet restructured his life. Morning muffled the city. The rain left the gutters running in thin, patient streams. Arthur called Mr. Henderson before breakfast. The lawyer's voice was professional and quick to the points Arthur had learned to love. Contingencies, signatures, discreet channels. Arthur did not want announcements. He wanted quiet remedies, mechanisms that would not humiliate, mechanisms that would survive his own hesitations. "I want a trust," he said, more to feel the words in his mouth than to debate them. "For Leo, for education, for housing, discreet, and I want Sarah considered for a role in overseeing it." Mr. Henderson paused, as if surprised by the inclusion of Sarah in the sentence. There was no legal obstacle to the idea, just human ones. Arthur had learned, in a life of contracts, that the exact phrasing mattered. He spent the morning drafting phrasing that would protect the child and the woman who had steadied him into admitting a wrong. In the months that followed, the mansion altered in small ways. Arthur began to keep different hours. He stopped making a show of the iron routines that had before been the only language he used with people. The appointments, the curt calls, the closed doors. He started to notice who cleared the silver, who brought in winter bedding, who hummed while they worked. He learned names that his staff had carried for years without his acknowledgement. He learned to ask about a knee or a son or a sister. He practiced listening, a clumsy, new muscle. There were practical beginnings. A tutor arrived, modest and patient, to meet Leo in the winter sunroom where the light touched the rugs. Arthur paid quietly for books and lessons. He did not attend the first tutoring session. He sent a note instead, a small envelope with a line. "Your focus is admired." Leo accepted the lessons with a seriousness that surprised no one who had known him the day he wrapped a jacket around a stranger. Children who can give like that tend to treat gifts with the same reverence. At first, Arthur framed these acts as repairs, patches to an old error. He watched how Leo learned fractions and literature, watched how the boy's posture shifted. He found himself in the back of an auditorium one spring, watching an assembly where Leo read aloud a poem about rain that made Arthur's eyes sting in a way he hadn't forecast. He walked home that night with a sense that events could be arranged not only to accumulate wealth, but to multiply something quieter, human dignity. Stories spread, as they do in houses with many rooms. Not all the news pleased his children. They visited sometimes in suits that matched the austerity of their voices. They asked questions about expense, control, precedent. "Father," one said, folding a napkin with the precision of someone used to fixing numbers, "are you certain? The foundation, the trust, this is irregular." Arthur listened without the reflex to shut the conversation down. He had once taught his children how to hedge and how to command. Now he taught them a different lesson by doing it, by saying simply, "I am certain," and leaving it at that. He knew his decisions would be met with resistance. He also knew that being predictable had not protected him from every cruelty life's ledger kept. There was value in leaving more than property, he now believed. There was value in leaving a way for someone else to become what he had never bothered to be. Years folded into each other. Leo grew taller. His school reports arrived crisp and hopeful. He learned to tie a tie for events and then unlearned to wear it as armor. He attended a local university on the trust's terms, not because Arthur wanted a reflection of himself, but because the boy showed a propensity for public service, small acts that by habit accrued into something important. Sarah kept her job for a while, then shifted into a new role that Arthur had arranged in one of his quieter moments, a position in the small administration of the educational trust, a role that allowed her to keep the household threads together while being paid in a manner that recognized competence rather than charity. Arthur's change did not come without friction. Old habits curled at the edges. He would find himself tempted to design tests, less cruel by degrees. But the memory of Leo's jacket halted him. He would sometimes retreat into coolness, then listen to a voice in his head that he recognized as new, the memory of a small boy smoothing an envelope rather than stealing it. Guilt tapered into responsibility. He paid attention differently. A decade later, the mansion felt lived in. The portraits that once glared now softened because they were looked at by people who smiled back. Arthur started inviting staff to meals, simple dinners where the conversation was about children's schools and not ledgers. He donated anonymously to neighborhood programs that built libraries, not plaques. He learned that philanthropy could be quiet and effective, a series of small, practical acts rather than ceremonies. He fell ill in his late 70s. It was a slow depletion, the kind that makes a man reassess not just assets, but the patterns he would leave behind. Mr. Henderson came often now, not merely as a legal advisor, but as a confidant who had watched the old man become slightly less brittle. Arthur dictated, then redrafted words of distribution. He made arrangements that would be difficult to reverse and backed them with legal care, because he had seen how messy good intentions can become without clarity. The last will was read in late autumn, the windows shut against a cold wind. The library, with its burgundy velvet and the familiar armchair, was fuller than it had been that stormy night a decade earlier. There were faces that mattered. Sarah, with eyes steadier than most. Leo, no longer the skinny boy, but a young man with shoulders that had learned responsibility. Mr. Henderson, his voice even as ever. And Arthur's biological children, who sat with polite restraint. They had the right to be there, and the right to ask questions. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and read. The language was precise, not theatrical. Arthur's estate, he explained, had been placed primarily into a trust to fund educational opportunities and community scholarships in the city Arthur had long supported. The legal mechanism allocated a life interest to ensure Sarah's continued stability and designated Leo as the principal beneficiary and, upon reaching a certain age, a member of the Trust's Oversight Committee with the ability to shape its mission. A hush noticed every syllable. The children exchanged looks. One asked quietly whether contesting the will would be wise. Mr. Henderson answered with dry legal facts. The document was sound, executed with due counsel, the trust constructed to limit opportunistic challenges. The tone of that answer was not triumph. It was the simple resolution of a man who wanted his last affairs handled without drama. Arthur's daughter, calm, somewhat startled, rose to speak. "Father," she said, "did you consult us? Did you—" "He consulted his conscience," Leo answered quietly, and that simple line held more power than any accusation. Leo was not defending the act as if it cleansed the past. He was recognizing a change in a man's priorities. "He wanted to do this," Leo said. "He wanted the help to be quiet and useful." Arthur's children were not villains in a storybook sense. They were complex, practical, and protective of what they had been taught to expect. They grieved certain things, the redistribution, the loss of a surname's concentrated wealth, the slight public humiliation of seeing their father's priorities shift, but they were not unkind. The moment had an awkward tenderness. People often react that way when their parents' habits change. After the formalities, in a smaller parlor away from the official reading, Arthur took Leo's hand and placed the old toy car in his palm. It had been polished, subtly, carefully, its gold wheel catching the low lamplight like a small sun. Arthur had kept it close through his illness, a talisman that reminded him of the night his assumptions broke. "Take care of it," he said simply, "and use what you have to give others more than you take." Leo's eyes filled, not with grand pronouncements, but with the steady gratitude of someone who remembered cold knees and a jacket that made a man feel less alone. "I will," he said. Arthur died that winter, with a weathered book at his bedside, and the memory of a hand, a small, careful hand, clearer than the rest. His funeral was modest, attended by those whose lives had been quietly altered by his change. Staff, neighbors, the children he had once believed himself to be protecting with stone. There was sadness and a gentle, inevitable goodwill. People spoke of some things, not all. They spoke of the toy car and the jacket as if they were less trinkets and more proof, a proof that choices, even small ones, can reroute a life. In the years after, the trust Arthur had set up enacted scholarships, paid private lessons, repaired roofs, and opened doors. Sarah oversaw the local distribution, preferring to work behind the scenes, preferring that recipients never have to feel the sting of charity announced on a headline. Leo took courses, then began working within the trust, learning governance and the slow, careful art of stewardship. He visited the mansion with less awe and more belonging, and one winter he sat in the old library, not as a guest, but almost as someone who had a claim beyond money, a moral claim, a history. Arthur's children continued their lives. They argued in boardrooms, they married, they carried on family businesses. They visited sometimes, their own faces softened by the passage of time, and a recognition that a patriarch's decision, strange as it had felt, had not been a theft of their identity, but a reallocation of what mattered. They forgave in small increments. They learned, perhaps grudgingly, that legacies are not merely plots of land and sums on paper, but reputations altered by one clear regret.